Lecture 5 introduces a model for the professional doctorate thesis. Now, this was originally designed with fine artists and practicing designers in mind, people undertaking a doctorate but whose subject and theme was principally their own work. Now, it became apparent to us in the Research into Practice group that this needed a particular approach. And it was clear to us what that approach should be because of the work that we'd done on the nature of research and the necessary structuring to make research a valid activity. And this is something that we've talked about in the previous 4 lectures. But this model, I think, also serves very well for professionals working in the context of the professional doctorate, who also are studying their own work to the extent that they are relying a lot on their tacit knowledge, their experience, their professional experience, basically a lot of subjective knowledge that they have as a result of working in their field. So not just creative practitioners, fine artists and designers, musicians, architects dealing with their own work, but the relationship of the professional to the model of knowledge that's required in the doctorate. So that's the transferability of this model. So I want to introduce some key components and say a little bit about why I think they are key components in the research thesis, bearing in mind the way that we have been talking about research up until now. Clearly, we need some research questions. So thinking about one's own work or one's own professional experience, the issue to be addressed in research questions is, are these questions that are only relevant to you, or are they research questions that are relative to other people, meeting the audience requirement of research? So you need to identify questions that perhaps are relevant to you, perhaps burning questions to you, the forefront of your professional activity, but nonetheless are going to resonate with a significant enough number of people that this makes the research activity worthwhile. Now, there is no fixed number of people. How many other people need to be concerned about this? Well, obviously it's going to have greater impact. It's going to warrant greater funding if that's one of the issues. The larger the audience is for this. But the reductio argument is this cannot be a question that is only of concern to one person, yourself. There needs to be a contextualization or a literature review. Now, the purpose of that, of course, is to identify the novelty, the originality of what you're doing. That's a requirement for the doctorate. It also needs to connect to existing knowledge. So we have some way of evaluating it, evaluating how it will contribute, where it will contribute, and perhaps evaluating the quality and the impact given what else has gone on in this field. There needs to be a method. Remember that the method is a defended, an argument for the way in which undertaking this research activity will address the question and will result in a significant answer or response to the question. So method has got a lot to do with the way in which your community think about the activity. What activities the community would also recognize as justifiable given your research question and your contextualization. So as a practicing fine artist, reaching for a paintbrush might be one part of the method for addressing a question, But if you are looking at an aspect of business in the creative industries, that's not a relevant activity. So method has got a lot to do with audience as well. Data or evidence, well, this is the key part of the subjective-objective debate. Remember that we're talking about subjectivity and objectivity in their philosophical meanings. So subjective knowledge is something that is known to me, but that is internal to me. So, for example, my experiences and my feelings, although I can talk about them, basically they belong to me and are personal, whereas something objective is something external to me and external to other people that I can basically point to or describe, something that we can refer to outside of our personal feelings. Now, in many creative areas, personal feelings are extremely important, and to some extent, personal feelings are unavoidable. We are all humans, so if we take a constructivist approach to research, then we can see that inevitably our constructs are all projections of individual people. We're not rocks, we are inanimate, we're not inanimate things, we are animate living creatures engaged with the activity that we are describing. But nonetheless, research relies on focusing more on the communicable aspects that can form part of an evidence-based argument in favour of our conclusions and our outcomes. Argument, yes. Well, I think obviously in a thesis, it's not just a matter of laying everything out, or putting paintings on the wall, or putting forward our data and simply standing back as though it were demonstrated. Quod eram demonstrandum. That's not part of a research thesis. There is an argument, in part, for how it is that the method contributes to the answer. In part, the argument is the defense of the gap analysis. Why is this a meaningful question that we should address, and to what extent is this left unaddressed by the literature? And of course there's a conclusion, a contribution, an answer, a response, the outcome, something identifiable. And the key thing here is you, as the researcher, need to claim intellectual property over some definable outcome. So you are going to say, I claim that I have found this, that I have contributed this. So it shouldn't be a subjective interpretation, what is the outcome of this research. There must be a clear conclusion where you are saying, I have found this and I am going to stand by this as my finding. Our last thing is the target audience or context of consumption. I think it's a good idea to make this explicit. For whom is this, or should it be, a significant outcome? Who should read the thesis? And if they did, who would be impacted by it? Who is it who would change what they are doing in response to the outcomes of your research? And this, of course, then focuses how you do it, how you phrase the questions, what literature you looked at, or of course, in literature here, I mean also exhibitions that you have looked at, particular works, particular artists, and so on. All of these things I'm assuming you already understand. We're trying to read in broad, transferable ways. But some of them, like distilling a clear question, distilling a clear conclusion, I think those I would like to point to say it's not enough to make a broad interpretation. So let's just go over these and see how they shake down. Research questions in more informal professional environments are often regarded as themes, as topics, as something rather generally interesting. That's where you start, but for research you do need to distill a clear, explicit question. It's going to be a sentence that that asks something explicit. Contextualization or literature review, well, the scope of that is quite varied. As I just said, it includes all kinds of manifestations, so it includes paintings and music and anything else that might be relevant. But what you're going to need to do is defend why it is that you looked at certain items and not others, and how it is that that informs your position. And particularly in the literature review, you are going to need to identify a gap, a part that has not been addressed that gives you the opportunity to contribute to your subject area. So you need to show that you have undertaken a search and a review that's comprehensive enough to reasonably expect that you have identified existing knowledge so that you can claim that there is a gap. If you've done this poorly or unsystematically, then you can't be sure that somebody else hasn't already addressed your question in some way. Methods are going to be some more formal than others. So in the professional domain, methods are often developed practically and on the go. They are found to be productive and used and are not necessarily analysed for their strengths, their weaknesses, for the conditions that would make them maximally effective. Now, I think in research you are going to need to have a critical approach to method, and so if this is an informal rather than a formal method, so something arising from the professional domain rather than arising from the academic domain, then I think in the professional domain you are going to need to formalize the method. That's something that you can work with your supervisor and discuss with your supervisor. Data or evidence, again taking this broadly, it's going to be paintings, music, all these things that I've already mentioned. But you need to be clear what it is that you are basing your argument upon. So you want to be clear when you are looking at perhaps a painting or listening to a piece of music, what aspect of this is the evidential part for your argument. So the data and evidence and argument part are joined together, I think. The conclusion, as I've said, that definitely needs to be explicit. That cannot be informal. That needs to be formal. It's going to be a few sentences, a couple of paragraphs perhaps at the end of the thesis, and there's going to be the target audience we've already described. So breaking this down into chapters then, remember this is a framework. This is given, I'm giving this in the spirit of providing a framework for somebody who doesn't have a better idea. So this is how to organize the thesis if you want a framework to simply plug something in. So there's an introduction in which you would set the context and in which you would identify the general issues and questions that are going to arise. Then we're going to move into a second chapter that contains the literature review. Third chapter can contain analysis. Notice identifying theoretical concepts to be used, because we're going to extract from the literature how are people already working with these sorts of issues so that we can use the same methods, or if we're critical of the methods, we develop a new approach. But what we do is going to be based on or reacting against what others have already done. there's the main case study. I've suggested that this is originally designed for fine artists, designers, so it's about their own work, but here it might also be your personal professional context. This can be fairly idiosyncratic. This might be quite individual to you, so you need to be clear about the extent to which this is transferable to others, and of course that relates to the audience. Who else is concerned with the same thing that you are? Secondary case studies are important. It's no good presenting your own work idiosyncratically. That weakens your argument for the impact of your research. We need to be able to see how this is transferable. It perhaps has got a main focus in your area, but there are other areas that it could impact, and therefore other people who are working perhaps on the margins of what you are doing. So it's a sort of what are they called? These mind maps, where we see close relationships and more distant relationships and map out the intellectual territory within which you're working. An explicit chapter on analysis is useful. Examiners are going to want to know that you have made a critical evaluation of the existing material. Pulling all these things into explicit chapters is part of the strategy for persuading the examiners that what you have done is worthy of a doctorate. That's another reason for me setting out a structure for you to fill in, because you might have done very worthwhile work, but the way in which you report on it, perhaps reporting on it more like a professional report than an academic report, may hide some of the things that you have done and some of the things that you have achieved. And this way we're pulling them all out so that we can see them very clearly. We're laying them all out explicitly. So there's no doubt that you have undertaken an analysis, for example. Conclusion. Now, yes, I just want to say here that conclusion is a restatement. So all the things, all the argument goes on in the previous 6 chapters. Chapter 7 is going to be very short. It's just a couple of pages in which you restate what you have already argued for. So none of the argument is there. I think there are no references, for example, no citations in the conclusion. It's just a very terse way of saying what it is that you actually are putting forward as your intellectual property and the outcome of this study. Notice also we have a statement about opportunities for future study. We're not expecting that what you achieve here closes down this matter. On the contrary, through the depth of the analysis that you have undertaken, you will also have identified some avenues that you've not pursued, but nonetheless are worthy of further research for you or for others. And that contributes to building a community. You are being generous in offering some new pathways for other researchers who come along and read your thesis and want to build on it. So there we have the 7 chapters as a basic skeleton that you can use to structure the professional doctorate thesis if you are either working with your own work in a creative field, such as painting or design, or you are working in a strongly professionalized context in which some of the formalization of academic study has not really taken place. So this is a way of imposing an analytical and academic structure on your professional experience.